The boardroom was a fortress of glass and steel, where the smell of cologne clashed with the metallic tang of power. At the head of the long mahogany table sat Richard Cole, a man who believed the world bent at his command. His empire, once untouchable, was trembling beneath the weight of lawsuits, recalls, and angry investors. But Richard wasn't worried. He never worried, not when he could find someone else to blame. On this day, the room was charged with nervous energy. Charts flickered on the projector, their red lines diving lower with every slide. Executives shifted in their seats, desperate to avoid Richard's sharp gaze. The tension broke not with a solution, but with laughter, a cruel, unexpected laugh. It came from Richard himself, directed not at an executive, not at an engineer, but at the janitor. Walter Green was mopping the polished tiles in steady, practiced strokes, a man invisible to most but ever present. He had spent decades cleaning this factory, listening more than he spoke, noticing things others ignored. His calloused hands had felt the vibrations of engines. His ears had picked up the subtle ticks of machines no one else could hear. And today, when the air grew thick with failure, he dared to speak. "Engines are running hot," Walter said quietly. "The polymer bearings can't hold the stress. Reinforce that part, and your cars will last." The room froze. A truth had slipped into the silence, uninvited but undeniable. For a flicker of a second, a few executives glanced at one another, almost impressed. But Richard broke the spell with venom. "I don't take advice from apes," he sneered. His words dripped with arrogance, slicing the air like a blade. "Pack your things. You're fired." Gasps rippled through the room. Walter didn't flinch. He simply set his mop aside, straightened his back, and walked out in silence. But what no one realized was that Richard had just dismissed the one man holding the blueprint for a $50 billion future. Long before Richard's empire began to crack, Walter Green had lived his life in quiet rhythm. Every morning, before the sky bruised with dawn, he rolled his mop bucket across the echoing factory floor. The air was sharp with aluminum dust, the hum of dormant machines sounding like a choir in sleep. His footsteps were steady, his motions deliberate, swish, lift, ring, repeat. To others, it was the monotonous work of a janitor. To Walter, it was music, and he knew the factory song better than anyone. He noticed what others dismissed: a high-pitched rattle in a test engine, a faint shimmer of oil pooling beneath a machine, a vibration that traveled through the floor like a whisper of something deeper. Walter wrote it all down in a weathered notebook, its pages filled with years of sketches, calculations, and quiet solutions. He had no degree, no title, no seat at the table. But he had knowledge, earned not from textbooks, but from decades of listening to steel, oil, and fire. The engineers mocked him behind his back. "Old man scribbles like he's keeping score of stains," one chuckled. Walter only smiled faintly and returned to work. He didn't need their validation. He knew that greatness wasn't always loud. It was often hidden in the corners, waiting for the right moment to rise. At lunch, he sat by the loading dock, sipping coffee from a dented thermos while trucks coughed in the yard. His eyes closed, mapping the sound of an engine struggling to breathe. To him, a stutter in combustion was as clear as a cracked note in a song. He jotted a line into his notebook. "Heat fade at 2,000 RPM. Polymer choice, wrong. Needs reinforcement." Walter carried these insights quietly, like a lantern only he could see. And though the factory floor bustled with noise and orders, he moved through it with calm discipline, unnoticed by most, underestimated by all. But the truth was simple. The janitor no one respected understood the heart of the machines better than the CEO who claimed to own them. The empire Richard Cole had built once gleamed like the chrome on his luxury sedans, untouchable, admired, envied. His cars rolled out of showrooms as status symbols, polished and powerful, their commercials boasting of innovation and dominance. But the shine was wearing thin. It began with whispers. A man at a service center muttered angrily into his coffee, 50 grand, and the thing died after 6 months. Another leaned closer, voice low but bitter. "Mine too." Transmission collapsed on the freeway. What started as murmurs spread like wildfire. Radio hosts joked about Richard's empire. Late-night comedians mocked his slogans. Better buy two, one for parts. Lawsuits piled up in legal offices like bricks stacked for a wall. Angry customers filled waiting rooms, clutching warranties like broken promises. The stock dipped, then plummeted. Yet, Richard marched through the plant as if he were invincible, his suit crisp, his jaw locked. He looked down from the mezzanine, seeing nothing but tools, machines, and bodies he believed replaceable. Walter, mop handle tucked under his arm, listened to engines falter in the test bays. Each cough, each stumble told him a truth no one wanted to face. Cost-cutting had stripped the machines of their soul. He paused, jotting notes in his battered notebook, careful not to draw attention. Material fatigue. Bearings cracking under stress. Reinforce, don't replace. But upstairs, the boardroom echoed with Richard's fury. Fix it, or I'll find people who can. His fist slammed against polished wood, veins bulging at his temple. Executives shuffled charts, their graphs bleeding red. No one dared tell him what Walter already knew. Pride deafened him. Arrogance blinded him. The workers whispered in break rooms. Crazy thing, that janitor probably knows more than the managers. The words hung like smoke, unspoken truth burning in the air. Yet still, Walter stayed silent. He cleaned, he listened, he wrote. Because storms always passed, and when they did, what remained wasn't arrogance. It was the work of steady hands. The boardroom reeked of stale coffee and desperation. Charts littered the table. Slides flashed graphs that nosedived like falling planes, and the hum of the air conditioner could not mask the clipped voices of executives locked in circles of blame. Suppliers, engineers, the economy. Everyone had an excuse, but no one had an answer. Through the cracked door, the faint squeak of wheels whispered. Walter pushed his mop slowly across the polished floor, his bucket rattling softly. He paused, head tilted, listening to fragments of the storm inside. Durability problem, billions on the line, a tired engineer muttered. Hell, maybe we should ask the janitor. He spends more time around the engines than we do. Nervous laughter rippled, but it wasn't cruel. It was resigned. The laughter carried to Richard. His eyes narrowed, jaw tightening. Bring him in. A hush fell when Walter stepped through the doorway, mop still in hand. His boots scuffed against marble, his shoulders slightly stooped, but his presence commanded more attention than anyone expected. Some smirked, arms crossed, waiting for comedy. Richard leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a sharp smirk. Well, Walter, he drawled, since my highly paid team can't solve this mess, why don't you enlighten us? What's wrong with our cars? Walter's voice was steady, low but firm. Engines are running hot. Polymer bearings can't hold the stress. They're cracking early. You cut costs on the wrong part. Reinforce them, and your cars will last. The words landed like stones in water. Silence spread. A few executives blinked, realization dawning. For a heartbeat, truth trembled in the room. Then Richard laughed. It wasn't humor. It was cruelty sharpened to a blade. I don't take advice from apes, he spat. You belong in the forest. You're fired. Gasps broke from the table. A few executives shifted uneasily, but none dared intervene. Walter stood tall, eyes calm, dignity intact. He nodded once, set the mop aside, and walked out. No shouting, no defense, just quiet certainty. What Richard didn't know, in dismissing Walter, he had unleashed the very storm that would one day drown him. The factory floor felt different that night. Without his mop and bucket, Walter walked slowly toward the exit, lunchbox tucked under his arm, the sound of his boots echoing against the very tiles he had made shine for decades. His job, his loyalty, his years of unacknowledged service, all erased in an instant by a man too arrogant to listen. Yet, Walter carried no bitterness on his face. Only a calm that came from knowing truth was on his side. Near the glass doors, a voice stopped him. Walter! From the shadows stepped David Langston, a quiet investor often overlooked in Richard's meetings. He was not the type to raise his voice, yet his eyes held sharp calculation. "You weren't wrong in there," he said plainly. "Those engines are failing exactly as you described." Walter shifted, uncertain. "Doesn't matter now. They've shown me the door." David shook his head, lowering his tone. "It matters more than you think. You know these machines better than anyone. I want to back you. Start your own line. Build it better." Walter's grip tightened on his lunchbox. For years, he had scribbled notes, drawn sketches, whispered solutions into the silence of a factory that never cared. Dreams lived in that battered notebook, but they had never reached beyond ink and imagination. Now, for the first time, someone with resources listened. "I'm just a janitor," Walter said quietly. David's reply was firm. "No, you're an engineer of experience, and with the right chance, you'll prove it." Months blurred into years of sweat, steel, and resolve. In a modest workshop, Walter poured himself into every detail. Hands blackened by grease, pencil behind his ear, eyes alive with purpose. Workers gathered around him, not as subordinates, but as partners. He tested engines alongside them, teaching by doing, earning respect through grit rather than title. Word spread. Orders trickled in, then surged. Families trusted his cars. Truckers swore by their durability. What began as a whisper grew into a roar. Walter Green, once invisible, was now building an empire brick by brick, while Richards was collapsing under its own arrogance. Richard Cole's empire was unraveling faster than even he could control. Headlines screamed of recalls, lawsuits, and staggering losses. Shareholders fled, investors pulled out, and once loyal customers abandoned the brand. On talk shows, experts who once praised his vision now dissected his arrogance like vultures circling carrion. The mighty king of Chrome had become a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, in a converted warehouse across town, the steady hum of progress sang a different tune. Walter's workshop, though modest at first, pulsed with energy and discipline. He didn't stand above his workers. He stood beside them. When grease stained their hands, it stained his as well. When engines roared to life on test benches, he was there, sleeves rolled, listening as though the machine spoke directly to him. Customers noticed. Word spread. Walter's cars weren't flashy. They were reliable, durable, and built to last. Families trusted them for long road trips. Truckers swore they could handle any load, any weather. Mechanics praised their design, marveling at the simplicity and strength. What began as a trickle of orders became a flood. Demand outpaced supply, and soon, Walter's workshop grew into a factory. Richard seethed as he watched his market share vanish, piece by piece. Once, he had mocked Walter as nothing more than a janitor. Now, whispers of the janitor's company haunted him in boardrooms and cocktail parties. The press adored the story. The man once fired in disgrace, now rising as a titan of industry. Investors who had abandoned Richard now courted Walter, eager to back a leader whose humility bred results. Richard's arrogance, once his armor, had become his downfall. He barked at the few executives who remained, demanding solutions no one could give. His suit grew rumpled, his face drawn, his confidence chipped away by the relentless truth. Walter Green was no longer the janitor. He was a competitor, and one who was winning. And as the empire of arrogance collapsed, the empire of humility rose in its place, unstoppable, undeniable, and built to last. The bankruptcy chamber smelled of sweat and stale paper. Lawyers shuffled thick binders, whispering numbers drenched in red. Richard Cole sat hunched at the end of a long oak table, his once pristine suit wrinkled, his tie hanging loose like a noose. The man who once strutted through factories as if he owned the air now looked cornered, stripped of his empire, his arrogance cracked like cheap glass. The heavy doors creaked open. Every head turned. Walter Green stepped inside, not in coveralls, not with a mop and bucket. Today he wore a dark tailored suit, shoes polished, shoulders squared. In his hand, he carried the same battered notebook from years ago, its edges frayed, its pages filled with the wisdom Richard had scorned. The room froze. Whispers rippled, and Richard's face drained of color. "You," he rasped, disbelief choking his voice. Walter's gaze was steady, unflinching. He took his seat at the table with the quiet authority of a man who had nothing to prove. Lawyers slid papers toward him. The contract was clear. Walter's company was buying out what remained of Richard's empire. The roles had reversed. The janitor now owned the kingdom the king had lost. Richard's voice cracked into a desperate plea. "You can't do this. You don't know what it takes to run an empire." Walter's pen moved smoothly across the page, each stroke deliberate, final. When he was done, he closed a notebook with calm precision and rose to his feet. His voice filled the silence. "Arrogance costs you everything. Respect costs nothing. The best ideas don't come from titles. They come from people you choose to ignore." No one spoke. Richard stared down at the table, broken, and Walter turned, walking out with the dignity that had carried him through every dismissal, every insult, every quiet day of work unseen. The janitor had become a man who redefined it all. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed like a storm of lightning. Reporters shouted questions, but Walter walked past them with quiet composure, his notebook still in hand. He didn't gloat, didn't wave, didn't boast. He had no need. The world already knew the story. The janitor who became the empire's savior, the man dismissed in arrogance who built a legacy from humility. Richard remained inside, slumped in defeat. His name would live on, but not as he had once dreamed. It would be etched in headlines as a warning. Pride unchecked, respect withheld, humanity ignored. His downfall wasn't the fault of engineers or markets. It was his own blindness. He had fired the very man who could have saved him. Walter's story, however, was only beginning. His factories expanded across states, then nations. His cars became symbols of reliability, not luxury for its own sake, but strength built for people who worked hard and needed something that lasted. Families trusted his name. Workers respected his leadership. Investors called him a genius, though he never called himself that. He remained, at heart, the same man who once polished floors and listened to the hum of engines in the dark. In interviews, when asked how he built a $50 billion company, Walter would smile faintly and lift his notebook. "By paying attention," he'd say. "Machines talk if you listen. So do people. Respect them, and you'll learn more than any boardroom ever teaches." His words spread beyond industry. Schools quoted him, leaders cited him, and those who felt overlooked, the workers, the cleaners, the ones mocked and dismissed, found in Walter's rise a reminder that dignity was not tied to titles. Because in the end, Walter proved a truth Richard never understood. Empires built on arrogance crumble, but those built on humility endure. And sometimes, the man you ignore today carries the blueprint for tomorrow's future. The janitor was never just a janitor. He was the architect of a story that the world would never forget.